So today we're talking about Father's Day and celebrating Father's Day and all those who have continued to serve as fatherly figures. As we go through this message today, what I want you to be thinking about is how the role has changed over time. Think back to when your grandfather was a father, and now look at the world today and how fatherhood has changed. It's also important for us to remember the incredible courage and sacrifice it takes to be that type of figure and to step in and help where you can. But most importantly today, I want to be able to convey to all of you, male and female, how important it is to have that male influence in the world and how it is absolutely necessary for the spirituality of people to grow. So let's begin with a recap of reflections on how much of the role has actually changed. So I'm going to go back to post-World War II for a minute. So post-World War II, the traditional father might have been what we call a white-collar worker. Somebody who works in an office, performs different administrative duties, manages, etc. But it was considered professional if you wore a white shirt. Your job was professional, white collar. This man would have been expected to work hard, serve as the financial backbone of the household, guide the children in proper presentation of themselves, make all the major decisions, and manage disciplinary issues. These fathers were financially secure, focused on ensuring their children found the right and perfect path to contribute to society. And those fathers didn't care what their children wanted to do in life. It was what would be best for them in order to make a contribution and be financially stable. The second group of post-World War II fathers were blue-collar workers. And they became known as that because with the automotive boom, there were lots of manufacturing organizations for cars being built, and men were being trained to be skilled in all these different trades. These fathers focused more on teaching their children the importance of self-esteem, self-reliance, self-motivation, and taking pride in one's work. For these fathers, telling your children what to do was not sufficient. They preferred modeling, opportunities to teach it, to have you see it, to have their kids or other people's kids shadow them. There were so many expectations placed on men in both of these groups to be strong and courageous and fearless, while at the same time being expected to be loving and kind and fatherly. It was never an easy path, and there was a lot of pressure on men to live up to society's expectations. And while the trend in fatherhood changed slightly with the baby boom, post-World War II, and families going from city life to suburb life, the biggest change came post-Vietnam. That's when fathers changed, the role of fathers changed completely. After men returned from Vietnam, many families were torn apart because the men who returned no longer reflected the men who had left. Men were struggling, rebuild their families, rebuild their lives, while at the same time suffering emotionally. And many continue to struggle today. Parent equality emerged post-Vietnam, and the roles of fathers began to change in a really good way. While it was difficult for families, it was the beginning of freedom. At that point, fathers were able to separate themselves from past traditions, and they were able to break barriers that we had never seen broken before. They were allowed to spend time at home with their children without the pressure of society. And eventually, over time, they were able to let go of their worries or control over their children's future and learn just to embrace the present moment because they appreciated the time they had. But imagine the courage it must have taken for a father or fatherly figure who grew up pre-20th century to all of a sudden have to speak to their grandfather or father and tell them they've decided to be a stay-at-home dad. Okay, now just hold that thought for a minute. First time ever in that tradition. And you tell them, I'm going to be a stay-home dad. My wife's making more money or my partner's making more money, and I'm going to stay at home. Now, the hardest part was keeping that commitment after you saw the look on their faces, right? But it was a huge change in our society. And during the following decades, traditional roles changed completely, and men were free to assume the father figure role of anyone they wanted to actually help without being told, why aren't you working? Why aren't you doing this? Why didn't you have your own children? On and on and on and on. Becoming a stay-at-home father and serving as the primary parent became an option. You didn't have to wait until you were forced into that situation. You actually had some choices. Men post-Vietnam were able to adopt children on their own, even if they didn't have partners. And dads were suddenly allowed to have fun. They attended school activities. They joined the PTA, and they could make parenthood look whatever they wanted it to look like. And in many ways, this was when living authentically actually came to be. So you remember, those of you who are older may remember, Father Knows Best, that character of Father Knows Best. Okay, most of us didn't know a dad like that. I sure didn't. So I used to watch that show and say, where do these people live? Like, who gets these kind of dads in their life? This is really interesting. But, the guy was perfect. Came home every day happy. Spoke with the children, wanted to check in. Not so much for everybody. But I love the fact that men in that day were able to start living their purpose. And most importantly, that is when men started to have the biggest impact in this world. It wasn't just in jobs. It was about parenting. It was about guidance. It was about mentoring. It was about coaching. They became mentors and champions for youth and seized opportunities to be resourceful in ways that tradition would have never afforded them before. There's a story I want to share with you about a man named Dennis Wilson, who was a varsity high school basketball coach. He acted as a mentor and fatherly figure to many of the boys who played on the team, and they were without fathers present in their lives. There was a young Davidson Hosty was his name. He said, growing up, I was an immature, angry kid with no father until I met Dennis Wilson. I remember one practice I mouthed off, and he told me I could leave if I didn't like what he was saying. I threw my jersey down and I stormed out. The next day, once I had calmed down, he taught me that it's a good thing for men to have emotions and express them, but that I couldn't let my emotions control me. That was a real turning point for me in my growth. Wilson stayed a part of Davidson's life long after he graduated from high school, encouraging and supporting him through earning both a bachelor's and a master's degree from Salem State and then getting his dream job in academics. Coach Wilson still calls me and checks in on me all the time. He's been instrumental in everything I've accomplished. He stepped in as my dad when I needed one the most, and while we may not share blood, he is a father to me. He calls me his son, and I consider it a great honor to be his son. Now, it's a beautiful story, and many of you probably have similar stories, ways that you have stepped up and helped somebody. From a spiritual perspective, though, fathers and fatherly figures have been increasingly more spiritually absent. And that's the part I want you to hear today. That over the years, less and less men have been present spiritually in their children's lives. This is partly because their fathers were not active in spiritual practices, and partly because mothers tended to be the shapers of faith in children's lives. Most adult children remember their mothers praying with them, if they remember prayer at all, not their fathers. But, and the big but is, statistics show that men can change the future of spirituality. I'm going to read these statistics slowly. I want you to take them in. If both father and mother attend church regularly, 33% of their children will end up as regular church goers. 41% will be irregular, and 26% non-church goers. If the father is irregular and the mother regular, are you ready for this? Only 3% of their children become regular churchgoers. Remember, I said when both go, 33%. When only the mother is regular, that number goes from 33 to 3. Now, when you look at the number of youth in our church, compared to the number that's possible of youth in our area that are eligible to be in church, and every church says the same thing, where are the kids? Where are the young adults? Where are the 18-year-olds? Where are the 20-year-olds? What happened to that demographic? They got lost because they didn't have spiritual champions. And the male is really responsible for making a difference. Yes, women can get their kids to go to church, but the difference will be when men can help us do that. Now, if the father is a regular churchgoer and the mother irregular, the number goes from 33% to 38%. But it gets even better. If the father goes to church regularly and the mother never goes to church, that number goes to 44%. Nearly half of youth would be regular churchgoers throughout their life. Now, if that doesn't make you think about the difference men can make, I don't know what could. But I'm just telling you, this is important for us to try and help men see the value of them getting their children involved in spiritual growth. And there was a second study that said as young adults develop a religious identity apart from their parents, or as religious identity changes, it is their father's religious characteristics that will become more important than their mother's. the mothers with whom their childhood religious identity most closely aligned with. The bottom line is this, that fathers and fatherly figures can make a difference in the future of what happens to spirituality long after we're all gone. It'll be the men that help us make that change. The Bible's always offered sound advice to fathers on parenting. I want to read 4 of them to you. 2 Corinthians says that who you are and how you live your life is like a letter from God that your kids read every day. Deuteronomy 6 advises fathers to spend time with their children, but states that that time should not be empty. It should be meaningful time, not just going through the act of being present. Psalm 103 talks about fathers having compassion for their children the same way God expresses compassion. And Chronicles 29 suggests that fathers pray for their children and explains that children who know their fathers are praying for them every day will grow up with a deep sense of love and security. Just knowing and hearing that their fathers pray for them. Fatherly figures have the power to change the direction of the future. And we celebrate the men today who have already taken this role on, who are already taking it on in a serious way. And all of us should stand by and encourage young men and men of all ages to start becoming spiritual mentors. Let's review today's lessons. Celebrating fatherly figures reminds us to first acknowledge the evolution of this role and how changes have led to inconsistent modeling. Number 2, to recognize the courage of all the people who have stood up, whether they were biological children or grandchildren or not. Unique situations require tremendous courage. Number 3, to mentor our youth to embrace spirituality, to demonstrate the practices you wish to develop. And number 4, to express gratitude for your mentors and coaches because they've been a blessing and a gift to you. So if you have somebody you need to call today, please do. Whether that's your father, grandfather, or a neighbor who was always kind to you, that would be the thing to do today. And our affirmation is, I celebrate the fatherly figures in my life. Let's say that together. I celebrate the fatherly figures in my life. And I want to end with a quote from Umberto Eco. It says, I believe that what we become depends on what our fathers teach us at odd moments when they actually aren't trying to teach us. We are formed by the little scraps of wisdom. Let's take that in. So we pause now to acknowledge the men in our life who have stood up as fatherly figures, the teachers, the wisdom providers, the uncles, anyone who may have helped shape us or taken time for us, friends who became mentors, saw that we needed to be championed. There's so many people to thank along the way who may have influenced us. But most importantly, we look at who we can encourage to step up and be a spiritual teacher and mentor to the youth, the young adults, their coworkers, people who need that kind of spiritual championing, even if it is just to pray for their highest good and to let them know that you are. And so it is. Amen.